Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. A warm welcome to everyone to our first Conversations on Consciousness. This is Nitin Sridhar, Chief Curator of Advaita Academy. And let us begin with a prayer. Sadashiva Samarambham Shankaracharya Madhyamam Asmadacharya Paryantam Vande Guru Paramparam. Today, we have a very special guest among us, Dr. Vivek Devroy, who really needs no introduction. However, uh, because introducing the speaker is my duty, I'll be just giving a very brief introduction. Dr. Vivek Devroy is a very renowned economist, scholar, and translator. He is currently serving as the chairman of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister. And as a translator, he has translated various ancient Indian texts into English and is best known for his magnificent rendition of the Mahabharata, as well as the three-volume Valmiki Ramayana and many Puranas, including Bhagavata Purana, Markandeya Purana, etc. And he has recently published the book, The Bhagavad Gita for the Millennials, and this will be the subject of our conversation today. Very warm welcome to you, sir, and thank you for agreeing for this conversation.
Namaste, Nitin. Always a pleasure.
So, sir, let me straight away jump with my first conversation. I want to first congratulate you on your new book. And my first question is, why this book? Why Bhagavad Gita for the millennials? And what inspired you to write it? What made you to write it?
The Bhagavad Gita is one of the most important of our texts. In the Vedanta school, it's one of the three. The Bhagavad Gita has been read widely. The Bhagavad Gita has been translated widely in several languages. It has been commented upon. People have interpreted it. There have been several bhashyas. But at the same time, it seems to me that there is an audience, perhaps particularly amongst the young, who have a very cursory familiarity with the Bhagavad Gita. And that is compounded by the fact that there are a lot of people who profess to be interpreters and therefore write my Gita, your Gita, his Gita, her Gita, Bhagavad Gita for managers, Bhagavad Gita for drivers, Bhagavad Gita for Nitin, Bhagavad Gita for so and so, so and so. And very few people actually read the Bhagavad Gita. So this book is not targeted at people who are familiar with the Bhagavad Gita. People who are familiar with the Bhagavad Gita will probably learn little from this book. It is particularly targeted at those, although the word millennials is used, meaning not just the young and millennials, but perhaps of interest to people who only know half a shloka from the Bhagavad Gita. And the half a shloka I have in mind is Karmanyevadhikaraste. Asked anything more about the Bhagavad Gita, they will not know. This is not a translation, this is not a commentary. I have done a translation of the Bhagavad Gita into English myself earlier. This is meant to motivate people to read the Bhagavad Gita, particularly in Sanskrit, to motivate people to read it in Sanskrit because it is beautiful poetry, and after that, read the bhashyas.
So, from the half a verse that you quoted, it just reminded me that I think that half verse was quoted in the Mahabharata serial in the 80s and 90s, I think.
Yes.
I think that could be the source of the knowledge of that half verse. So, moving further, before I jump into questions from the book, Basically, I have arranged the questions more or less chapter wise, and as I was reading chapter by chapter, what thoughts that came to my mind, based on that, I have arranged the questions. But before jumping to that, I want to ask you a question about your own life journey. I mean, you have been engaging with Hindu texts for many decades now. So I want to know, how did your introduction to Hindu philosophy and textual tradition happen, and who were your early influences, if any, and how this engagement with Hindu texts have influenced your life. It may be in a day-to-day life, or it may be in a spiritual aspect. What kind of influence these study of these texts, translation of these texts, has had you as a person?
I will divide it into two parts. The first part is pre 2004, and the next part is post 2004. And these two, there was a structural break, so to speak, in my life in 2004. So let me respond to these two in these two different parts. Pre 2004, my earliest interest in these things started in the very early 80s. In the very early 80s, I got acquainted with a professor who's now dead. He was a famous professor in his time. He was known as a professor of economics, although his fundamental specialization was statistics. And this was Professor Ashok Rudra, who used to teach in Vishwabharati. I used to teach in Presidency College, Kolkata. So once in a while, we used to meet. Professor Ashok Rudra was Marxist in his orientation. So therefore, he thought that he thought I did not deserve to discuss economics with him. He was contemptuous of my kind of thinking. So, by mutual consent, almost, we decided to talk about the Ramayana and Mahabharata, things on which he used to write essays at that time. Once casually, I remarked to Professor Ashok Rudra that in the Mahabharata it says that the five Pandava brothers became accomplished in the use of five different kinds of weapons, Bhima and the Gada, and so on and so forth. So, what happens if I do a statistical test to examine the frequency with which these five Pandava brothers used the five different kinds of weapons or the different weapons to see if there was any statistical difference in the frequency? Most people would have said, "You are mad." Professor Ashok Rudra said, "Here is my copy of the Mahabharata, take it and do it," to his eternal credit. If you leave out Divyastras, the fiercest fighting in the Kurukshetra war occurred in the course of Drona Parva, which is when Drona was the commander of the Kaurava army. And these were days much before computers, so I painstakingly sat down with Drona Parva, did those tally marks, if you remember those tally marks, how many times was this used, how many times was that used, and did a paper, except that paper was in Bengali. So it was published as a paper in Bengali. More or less at the same time, there was a chance encounter with two shlokas by two great poets, none of whom were able to date very satisfactorily, except perhaps there was 500 years between them. The first one was Valmiki, the second one was Kalidasa. And Valmiki Ramayana, this is from the part where Rama knows that Sita is in Lanka, but he cannot invade because there is a monsoon. The monsoon is raging, so he has to wait before the monsoon is over before he can actually invade Lanka and kill Ravana. And Valmiki, who was phenomenal at describing nature, says, Vidyut Pataka Savalaka Mala Shailendra Kota Kriti Sannikasha Garjanti Megha Samudir Nada Matta Gajendra Iva Sangyugasta. The clouds are tinged with flags of lightning, garlanded with flocks of cranes, What do the clouds look like? The clouds, they are roaring. The clouds resemble mighty elephants, Matta, Gajendra. And what are the mighty elephants doing? They are fighting. Kalidasa in Meghdutam, there is no particular story in Meghdutam except a yaksha has been negligent in his duty, so he's been banished by his lord and master Kuvera from Alakapuri, and he has therefore been banished. He's in exile. While he's in exile, he sees a cloud. He pines for his beloved and invokes the cloud, sends the cloud as a messenger to his beloved in Alakapuri. So the first part of Meghdutam is the cloud going there. The second part of Meghdutam is the cloud coming back. Right towards the beginning of Meghdutam, it says, आषाढ़स्य प्रथम दिवसे मेघमाश्लिष्ट सानुम वप्र क्रीड़ा परिणत गजम प्रेक्षणीयम ददर्श. The first month of Ashar, the yaksha sees these clouds. And what do these clouds resemble? The clouds resemble elephants. But because the yaksha is pining for his beloved, these clouds, vapra krira, is what elephants do when they use their tusks to dig up the mud, to dig up the ground, to dig up the earth. So these elephants are playing. And I thought, this is remarkable. Two different poets comparing clouds to elephants. Rama, who wants to fight, the elephants are fighting. Yaksha, who's missing his beloved, the elephants are playing. So I must read this literature. So these things happen more or less at the same time. Then, in the course of my professional career, I took a job at the Gokhale Institute of Politics and Economics, went off there, and right next door was the walking distance was the Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute. At that time, the Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute, even now, the Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute has a journal called the Annals of the Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute. The editor of the Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute at that time was Dr. G.B. Palsule. Later on, he became director of the Bhandarkar Institute, but at that time, he was the editor of the journal. So I translated that Bengali essay on the weapons of the Kurukshetra war, into English and took it to Dr. Palsule. Dr. Palsule, to his eternal credit, looked me up and down and said, "What do you do?" I said, "I am an associate professor at the Gokhale Institute." To his eternal credit, he said, "Leave the paper, we will get it refereed." Ashok Rudra was not a scholar in Indology. So the edition of the Mahabharata he'd given me, it was an unabridged edition, but the text in Sanskrit, the Sanskrit text was something based on the Eastern edition, and it was called the Arya Shastra edition. And I had done my thing on the basis of that. At that time, I had no idea that the Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute's critical edition existed. The referee said, "Wonderful paper, we will print it." He didn't exactly use the word idiot, but he said, "Does this idiot not know that there is something called a critical edition?" So again, back to tally marks, and the editions are not the same. So while I was in Pune, not just this, about 5 or 6 different papers on different kinds of things were published in Annals of the Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute. In the course of work, I came to Delhi, professor at the Indian Institute of Foreign Trade. At that time, you mentioned the TV serials. At that time, the Mahabharata serial was the rage. So I thought, why not put all of these essays together, publish them in the form of a book? So this book was published, some essays on the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. It was jointly dedicated to Ashok Rudra and G.B. Palsule.
Is the book still available, sir?
No, I'll come to that in a minute. They're jointly dedicated to G.V. Palsule and Ashok Rudra. I went to Ashok Rudra Who said, thank you very much. Who is G.V. Palsule? I went to G.V. Palsule. He said, thank you very much. Who is Ashok Rudra? In some ways, this also represents my life. There are two parallel trajectories, and people who identify as an economist say, what on earth is this? And people who identify me as a translator say, what is going on? Anyway, this book is out of print because the publisher has gone bankrupt, not because of this book, but even otherwise. The book got excellent reviews, but it did not sell much. So this happened. After that, having read the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, I should read the Puranas. I began to read the Puranas, tell the stories to our sons who were young then. At that time, the publisher of my economics books was someone named Praveen Mittal. So I casually mentioned to Praveen Mittal that he's a publisher, DK Publishers. I mentioned to Praveen Mittal, I'm telling these stories of the Puranas to my sons. They seem to be enjoying them. So he said, why don't you translate these Puranas into English? You must abridge them and reduce each of them to 100 printed pages. Skanda Puran is something like 85,000 shlokas. Padma Puran is 55,000 shlokas. Markandeya Puran is about 8,000 shlokas. So try and reduce each of them to 100 printed pages is not really fair. But anyway, this is what was done. So these 19 Puranas were published. 19 because I also decided to do the Bhavishya Puran. Then he said, why don't you do the Vedas? So I did the 4 Vedas, 11 major Upanishads, all compressed into those 100 printed pages. They were terrible translations, very bad translations. I won't recommend them to anyone now, but they sell, they still sell. I have no idea why they still sell, but they still sell. After this, I went to a book fair. At this book fair, I met Praveen Mittal. Praveen Mittal tells me, your books are doing very well now. I want you to do the Vedas. Not abridged, unabridged. Starting with the Rig Veda, we'll have the Sanskrit on one side, we'll have the English on the other, unabridged. I was not interested, but to fend him off, I said, all right, let me go and read the Vedas. When you're doing an abridged translation, you don't read every word carefully. When you know you're going to do an unabridged translation, you read every word carefully. When I began reading the Rig Veda, I found that in the Rig Veda, dogs are used as beasts of burden. Not your audience, but otherwise people often don't know that the Vedas are essentially mantras in the addressed to a particular divinity. In the Yajurveda, I find a mantra that's addressed to a dog. So I got interested in dogs, and soon I had a manuscript. I kept digging up things on dogs, whatever was available on dogs, Panchatantra, Vedas, Ramayana, Mahabharata. For example, to just give an example, when Bharat is in his maternal uncle's house and the messenger goes saying that Dasharath has died, the messenger does not tell Bharat and he doesn't tell Bharat and Shatrughna that Dasharath is dead. So Bharat and Shatrughna come back with a lot of gifts. Kekai was famous for horses, so they come back with horses, blankets, etc. But also, Valmiki Ramayana says they brought back dogs which had been bred inside the palace. So soon I had an entire manuscript in dogs. And Sarama is the mother of all dogs or the dog of Devas. Either way. And Rig Veda has this conversation between Sarama and the Panis, and which is why dogs are called Saramaya. So I had this manuscript, and 14 publishers refused it.
Oh,
Roughly at the same time, on 17th of January 2004, I had a heart attack. Heart attack is a perfectly normal thing these days. Everyone has a heart attack. Not everyone. All kinds of people have heart attacks, and heart attack is not very serious provided you are taken care of in the first 1 hour, the so-called golden hour. In my case, it just so happened that the doctor was negligent. So I was not in hospital. I was not taken to hospital for almost 30 hours. So in a sense, because 36 hours had passed, in a sense, I was lucky to be alive. So to use a cliched expression, when you're lying down on that bed, waiting to be wheeled into the operating theater, and you are looking out of the window and you can see the sun shining and you can see the trees and you can see the birds chirping on the trees. To use that cliched expression, it's almost as if your life flashes by in front of you. And I therefore took stock and I decided that I have to decide what my priorities are. If I survive, I will take stock of what my priorities are. Why am I part of this rat race? I will consciously opt out of that rat race. I took a resolution that if I survive this particular year, I will bring out 15 books edited and authored. No, 12 books edited and authored. And after that, I will forget about the rat race. I will do whatever I want to do. Eventually, if you want to publish 12, you shoot for higher. So I actually eventually ended up publishing 15 books. But the long and the short of it is, this led to a complete re-examination of everything I was doing. This led to a complete re-examination of priorities, family relationships, everything. And meanwhile, more or less at the same time, Sarama and her children, that book was published, accepted and published by Penguin. And Penguin told me, we have always been interested in a translation of the Bhagavad Gita. Will you do the Bhagavad Gita? So I did the Bhagavad Gita. So that was the structural break. Bhagavad Gita, Penguin's interest, my taking stock of my life. So the second lot of translations after 2004 have been completely different in nature.
so I think that kind of laid the foundation for all the translations that came up later, the Mahabharata and the Valmiki Ramayana and now the Puranas. You're currently doing the Puranas, right, sir?
Yeah, you see, having done the Bhagavad Gita, I was confident about my Sanskrit. And again, there was a trigger. The trigger for the Mahabharata was I read, by the way, the Mahabharata has been translated in unabridged form into English only thrice, only 3 times. Kishori Mohan Ganguly beginning about 1883, Manmathanath Datta beginning about 1892, and the third one is mine. So only 3 unabridged translations. There was an attempt that was started by Professor Van Buitenen at the University of Chicago, but Professor Van Buitenen died before being able to complete it. Professor Van Buitenen, some words from Sanskrit are impossible to translate into English. They should never be translated. Kshatriya, well, once you can translate it, but otherwise I think Kshatriya should be just Kshatriya. Van Buitenen, Kshatriya is translated as barren, which sort of jars. Well, I was reading the Van Buitenen translation. There is this famous instance of Nala and Damayanti and Nala gambling. And Van Buitenen says, the text says, Kali, as in Kali Yug, evil, had entered Nala, which is why Nala had gambled. Van Buitenen,
Kalipurisha.
yeah. So So Van Buitenen's translation says Kali entered Nala. And I thought, what?
Oh,
Kali? In the Mahabharata, Kali? And I'm not very sure whether they translate from the Devanagari or they translate from IAST. If it is IAST, it is very easy to miss that mark at the top. So that was essentially the trigger. And the biggest problem was a mental block that Mahabharata, 100,000 shlokas, where critical edition has less, but 100,000 shlokas, my 10 volume translation runs into 2.25 million words, compounded by the fact that there were at least three people who had tried to translate the Mahabharata and died halfway. So my wife did not exactly discourage me, but she didn't exactly encourage it either. Mahabharata is not supposed to be very auspicious anyway. So eventually the Mahabharata translation happened. It was published with 2 volumes a year. Then there is a 10 volume box set. And after that, when we meet Krishna in the Mahabharata, Krishna is already an adult. So a question was asked about Krishna's childhood exploits, which are also there in the Puranas, but they are there in something called the Harivangsha. The Harivangsha is loosely called a Purana. Technically, it is not a Purana. Uh, so I did the Harivangsha next. After that, inevitably, I did the Valmiki Ramayana. And my next big project is the so-called Purana project, which you mentioned, is to translate in unabridged form the Ashtadash Mahapuranas, the 18 Mahapuranas. Mahabharata is 100,000 shlokas. The 18 Puranas together are 400,000 shlokas. So together it will amount to 12 million words. And some of these Puranas, mind you, I'm not talking about major ones like Bhagavad Puran. Bhagavad Puran has been translated. In English, it has been translated in unabridged form 5 times. But there are some Puranas, not read that much, which have probably never been translated into English. Some of them have never been translated in unabridged form, not abridged, even in something like Hindi. So Bhagavad Puran has been published, Markandeya Puran has been published. 2 Puranas have been done but are waiting for publication with Penguin because of COVID. They will be published this year. They are Brahma Puran and Vishnu Puran. And I've just started on Shiva Puran.
wonderful, sir. Wonderful. I mean, it's I really admire this, and I was reading your book on Manmatna Nadda, and that is another wonderful book. I felt like like a Sherlock Holmes trying to search the origins of Manmatna Nadda in that book. Anyway, so returning to your new book on Bhagavad Gita, I want to now take up some questions on the Gita. The one of the first things I noticed in the very right in the introduction is you gave a list of around 58 different types of Gita. Normally, it has been, the Bhagavad Gita has been so famous, so well known that Gita has come to be synonymously used with to mean as Bhagavad Gita. But of course, there are others like Ashtavakra Gita, Uddhav Gita, Guru Gita, and all. But even I was not aware that there are as many as 58. So at least some three of them caught my eyes as I was going to the list. One is Putra Gita from Varaha Puran, Vanar Gita from Parashar Samhita, and Mahishi Gita from Bhagavad Puran. Can you shed more light on these three Gitas and what kind of topics they deal with?
As a background, the word Gita means something that is sung. And Bhagavat is an adjective, really. So, therefore, Bhagavad Gita automatically means it is only one kind of Gita. There should be other Gitas, there can be other Gitas. The question is, what is a Gita? Sometimes the text in a chapter, in the heading, in what academics call the colophon, which comes at the end, says this is the Gita. But one must be a little bit careful because these colophons, chapter headings, etc., they came later. It is by no means obvious that they had existed in the text in the beginning. In the Mahabharata itself, there are at least 20 Gitas, other than the Bhagavad Gita. The one some people know of, and it is one that has been translated by Telang a long time ago in the Sacred Books of the East series, is the Anugita. It's the only other Gita which is Krishna speaking to Arjuna. But there are other Gitas also in the Mahabharata, like the Dharmaved Gita. If I take something like Yaksha Prashna, it is not technically called a Gita, but the subjects discussed are very similar to Gita. Often, sorry, Nitin, were you saying something? Often we take Gita to mean that which concerns moksha dharma, that which concerns the afterworld, afterlife, beyond samsara, mukti, moksha, kaivalya, freedom from samsara. But mukti, moksha are paths pursued by very few people. Most people then and even now are engaged in samsara as grihasthas. So for them, something like the Dharma Ved Gita, which is about Garhastha Dharma, is much more pertinent. One reason why I'm interested in the Itihas and Purana part of it is because Itihas and Purana, the Pancham Veda, they are about householders. Whereas if you look at something like the sacred books of the East, Hinduism becomes equated either with Vedas, Upanishads, particularly Upanishads, sometimes the Dharma Shastras, these which reflect what people were actually doing are never always translated. When this list that I mentioned, it comes from two sources. One is the Sanskrit documents website, which has a list of Gitas, and there are a few more in the Gita super site that has been created by IIT Kanpur. These Gitas belong to three different groups. There are Gitas which are part of the Mahabharata. There are Gitas which come from the Puranas. And there are other Gitas which sort of are standalone. Like you mentioned the Ashtavakra Gita. The Ashtavakra Gita is an example of that. And it's one of my personal favorites. For people who do not know, Ashtavakra was a great sage who was cursed by his father, and therefore he was born crooked in 8 of his limbs, hence Ashtavakra. While he was still relatively young, he instructed King Janaka. This King Janaka is not necessarily Sita's father, because all of those kings in that lineage were known as Janakas. Anyway, so the first shloka of Ashtavakra Gita, it's sort of in one shloka, it captures everything that we are looking for. When King Janaka asks Ashtavakra, Kathang Jnanam Avapnoti, Kathang Muktihi Bhavishyati, Vairagyam Va Kathang Praptang Etad Bruhi Mama Prabhu. How do I get knowledge? How do I develop non-attachment? How am I liberated? Oh Lord, please tell me this. But to come back to what I was saying, so I have done a translation of the Mahabharata Gitas with the Sanskrit and the English, which will be published by Penguin next year. When I say Mahabharata Gitas, these are Gitas from the Mahabharata, but there is a Gita I have included, which is known as the Pandav Gita. The Pandav Gita is not from the Mahabharata, it has protagonists from the Mahabharata, and quite often we quote things from the Pandav Gita without necessarily knowing where it is from. We think it is from the Mahabharata, but it is not. Dharmang janami nacha me pravritti, adharmang janami nacha me nivritti, attributed to Duryodhana. Where is this from? This is from the Pandav Gita. Pandav Gita, I don't think has been translated into English. Anyway, so I have this 25 Gitas, which I have translated, and Penguin will publish them next year. If the market accepts this, and obviously a publisher wants to know what the market is like, there is an idea of a second volume which will have the Purana Gitas, and a third volume which will have the other standalone Gitas. Now, the reason I went off on a digression is the Pandava Gita is all about bhakti, entirely about bhakti. Bhakti, obviously, to Krishna. Exactly similarly, the Vanara Gita is also devoted only to Hanuman. Hence, it is called the Vanara Gita. It is all kinds of shlokas dedicated to the greatness of Hanuman, not Krishna. Mahishi Gita is about Krishna's wives. Krishna had 8 wives, so each of them again suffused with bhakti. Putra Gita I don't know because it is from a Purana that I have not yet translated. There is also a Putra Gita in the Mahabharata. But this particular Putra Gita I have not yet translated, so I can't answer your question. One must realize that one of the things in all of these texts is that you can learn from all kinds of people. You can learn from you have an Ajagara Gita. So you learn from an Ajagara, a python or a boa constrictor. There is a famous shloka from the Mahabharata which is quoted quite often about relationships. Kashtancha samayetang mahadadau sametta cha vepayetang tadvad bhuta samagava. Like two pieces of wood floating on the ocean, the two pieces of wood come across, float together for some time, and then drift apart. Where is this from? It's from the Mahabharata. Where from the Mahabharata? It is from something called the Pingala Gita. And who was Pingala? Pingala was a courtesan, a prostitute.
Wonderful, wonderful, sir. Um, I have always found the opening verse of Bhagavad Gita quite intriguing. You know, the Dharmakshetre Kurukshetre Samaveta Yutsavaha. I find that though most of the traditional commentators, Acharya, have not commented on the first chapter, I find that this verse kind of sets a stage for the entire Kurukshetra war, and there is a deeper philosophical underpinning to it. What are your thoughts on this?
You see, I think, and this is a point that this book also makes, I think the Bhagavad Gita is beautiful, beautiful poetry. 11th chapter, who can translate it? No one can translate it. But even the first chapter has beautiful poetry. One of the things this book argues is you should read the Bhagavad Gita for its beautiful poetry. And most of the Sanskrit poetry was not about rhyming, it was chandas, a metrical structure, and one of the most common ones is the Anushtup. The Anushtup is 8 aksharas in each line, 4 lines, and of course, something that I will ignore, which is the combination of Laghu and Guru, light and short aksharas in a line, but that's a complication I will avoid right now. So 8. So why is it people do not realize Dharma Kshetre Kurukshetre 8 Samaveta 8. Why don't people appreciate this Vakratunda Mahakaya 8? Surya Koti Samaprabha 8. Saraswati Mahabhage, so on and so forth. Ya Devi Sarva Bhuteshu, beautiful poetry. Unfortunately, when people look at the Bhagavad Gita, people generally look at it with eyes of dharma. There is no direct dharma in the first chapter. There is no direct dharma until, depending on how you look at it, until the third shloka or the 11th shloka of the second chapter. So any commentary actually doesn't even begin with the second chapter, it begins with the third shloka or the 11th shloka. And hence I completely agree with you that the first chapter should also be talked about. By the way, you see, Dharma Kshetre, it is Kurukshetre, it predates Kurukshetra, as in the battle of Kurukshetra, because there is a difference between a Kshetra and a Tirtha. A Kshetra typically does not have flowing water. Tirtha has flowing water typically. Tirtha, you go down and therefore it has water. So Kurukshetra, even before the Kurukshetra war, it is known as Kurukshetra because the ancestor of the Kurus and the Pandavas, both Kuru, performed austerities there. Performed austerities there, and what was his desire? That everyone on earth should immediately go to heaven. And Indra came and said, how is this possible? Everyone can't go to heaven. So eventually the vara was granted to him that anyone who died fighting in Kurukshetra would go to heaven, which is why Duryodhana and all the others ended up in heaven. So it had a tradition of being a Dharma Kshetra much before the Bhagavad Gita, much before the Kurukshetra war. It had an association with Parashuram. It was Samanta Panchak, the five lakes of blood that were filled with the blood of Kshatriyas that Parashuram killed. And we can also interpret all of this in a completely metaphorical sense. The Dharma Kshetra, Kurukshetra is nothing but we. It is a metaphorical, allegorical account of what happens within us, within our own body.
Wonderful. That is a very perspective that I was not aware of. That anybody who dies in Kurukshetra in a battle goes to Swarga. So that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. So moving on, my next question is from the first chapter of your book, the Mahabharata. As I was reading through the chapter with all its details about a kind of a summary of the findings of the modern scholarship on about the dating of text, the question of authorship, speculations about whether Gita is a single author text or is it a patchwork. I mean, I have read some very nasty pieces of work from German Indologists wherein they dismantle Gita into different layers. I mean, there was a originally Sankhya layer, and then the Brahmins added some Vedanta layer. I don't know. So many things have done. So what struck me was while much of the modern scholarship concerns itself into this historical criticism or history of the text, reception, and such kind of questions, the tradition itself, the Hindu tradition, the tradition of our acharyas, of Shankaracharya, Madhusudana Saraswati, or any of the commentators, and even modern day acharyas who speak about Gita, their focus is on making the Gita relevant here and now. The ethical, the spiritual, and the philosophical teachings that we can learn from Gita to make our life better here. Whereas the modern scholarship, the Western scholarship's agenda is to reduce Gita into a museum artifact whose relevance is only in the study of a socio-political history as a tool for socio-political history of some past. So kind of, it the analogy that comes to my mind is that it is like searching for the dead and the decayed trees from the past while missing the living and flourishing forest which is in front of one. So what are your thoughts on this, sir?
I have two kinds of thoughts. The first one is the message of the Bhagavad Gita And the message of many of our texts is internal to us. And that is an eternal and perennial, perpetual question, internal. It is not dependent on whether I can produce Krishna's birth certificate, whether I can produce Krishna's Aadhaar card. I am not sure how Krishna react to the question of to them also. It is completely irrelevant. I'm not talking about the scholars. Exactly the same way, I think this vivisection, this analysis of Krishna's historicity, the Mahabharata's historicity, it's completely irrelevant. However, this book is addressed to a target audience, and that target audience includes people to whom these questions are important, or they seek answers to these questions not because they want those answers themselves, but because they are asked by their friends. Remember, we are talking about one particular slice of Indian society that takes pride in saying, I am atheist, that takes pride in saying, I am agnostic. The word a means negation. So how can I say I am a theist unless I say what the theist part is that I am contradicting? Otherwise, it's a meaningless term. How can I say I am agnostic without explaining what the gnostic part of it is? And gnostic has the same cognate root as it's cognate with the same root as Gyan. How can I be against Gyan? So this is a slice of society we are talking about who, pardon my saying this, who behave like Pakistan in the sense of defining itself as the negation of India and not having its own identity. So I am seeking to answer their questions, not sort of propagating my views. So far as historicity is concerned, therefore, I have taken pains to document the historical evidence that has been thrown up about the historicity of the Kurukshetra war. The existence of Dwarka, archaeological excavations that people don't even seem to be aware of. This is another part. The other part is about the Bhagavad Gita being an integral part of the Mahabharata. And shlokas that are in the Bhagavad Gita occur almost in identical fashion in the Mahabharata with slightly different tones. If I ask, Yada yada hi dharmasya glanirvavati parantapa abhyuthanang adharmasya tadatmanang srijamaham. I ask people, where is this from? People will say it's from the Bhagavad Gita. It isn't. It is from the Mahabharata. I did not say yada yada hi dharmasya glanirvavati bharata. I said yada yada hi dharmasya glanirvavati parantapa. The chanda breaks down, which means it was probably a later interpolation. But the point is that it is elsewhere in the Mahabharata. If I look at the Moksha Dharma section, when Bhishma is lying down on his bed of arrows and has this discourse instructing Yudhishthira, everything in the Moksha Dharma section is an integral part of the Bhagavad Gita. Some of these questions were addressed many, many years ago, critiques of those Western scholars in a fantastic book, which now I think has been translated into English. No, I not think, I know it's been translated into English. This is Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay's Krishna Charitra. I would recommend it to anyone. Finally, the Bhagavad Gita has different strands in it. This does not mean they are distinct strands. It is like my having a body. My body has a mind, which is the Gyan. My body has a heart, which is the bhakti. My body has hands and feet, which are karma. But this does not mean that these are distinct. Similarly, the Bhagavad Gita has Sankhya, and the word Sankhya used in the Bhagavad Gita is not only in the sense that the word Sankhya is used in the Sankhya text. Ditto for yoga, which most people know, Sankhya Yoga, but it also has Nyaya a little bit. It has tapas, which is a word that cannot be translated into English as austerities because it has the sense of scorching, purifying. And I'm very glad that in a slightly different context, your book on menstruation also brought up the issue of tapas. And it has the Pancharatra, the bhakti. And unfortunately, the Pancharatra school in commentaries on the Bhagavad Gita, it's rarely mentioned. So it is all of these together, but this does not mean that they are separate in any sense. They are all part of the same perception. And therefore, I also mentioned some excellent work. I'm not saying that is the last word on the subject, but that some excellent work that was done by Yardi in actually statistically testing whether there are multiple authors in the Bhagavad Gita. And he found no, the Bhagavad Gita does not have multiple authors. The Mahabharata, as the text we have today, it has 5 different authors, but not the Bhagavad Gita.
I think I have a question which is very related to what you just discussed. This is with respect to the 4th chapter in the book, the Bhagavad Gita synthesis, wherein you mention how Bhagavad Gita as a text synthesizes different darshanas like Sankhya, Yoga, Mimamsa, and Vedanta. And I would suggest all those who would be watching this interview to definitely check out that section because it is a wonderful presentation on how different strands of philosophy have been put together and reconciled and made sense. However, my question is regarding the appropriateness of the use of the term synthesis itself. I mean, the notion of synthesis appears to insinuate a kind of an innovation, a new kind of thinking that integrated and reconciled existing rival or parallel traditions, parallel schools of thought. And further, this term synthesis has a theological baggage from a in a Hegelian theory. It has its roots in Hegel, the European philosopher who propounded that first there is a thesis and then there is antithesis, and which gives rise to synthesis, and wherein he means by synthesis a kind of a sublation, a superposition of both the thesis and antithesis. But in Bhagavad Gita itself, in chapter 4.1, Sri Krishna mentions that what he's teaching Arjuna, it has been originally taught by him to Surya, and from Surya to Manu, and from Manu to Ikshvaku. So it is saying that basically the teaching is a very old teaching. It is not a new innovation, and it has been transmitted in regular succession, Guru Shishya Parampara. So, irrespective of the dating of Gita, the text itself is seem to be aware that the teaching presented is not an innovation. It's not a synthesis per se. So, it's not a supersession or a sublation of an older teaching. So, how do we reconcile this text self-statement with the notion of synthesis?
The word synthesis is used in a certain context. But if I look at the Bhagavad Gita, what do we know about the text, to the extent we know anything at all? About the text, we know that this text in its present form is probably 500 CE in its present form, to the extent there is certainty about any of this. But that is the text in its present form. not text as in written down, but oral transmission. The thoughts there in the text go back to the time of Krishna. And again, I'm sure many people will contest this, particularly people who believe in astronomical datings. But Krishna, let us say, is 1500 BCE, 1600 BCE. I'm saying this on the basis of the archaeological excavations in Dwarka. The name Krishna occurs in the Upanishads also. So it is quite clear that we had Krishna who was preaching this kind of philosophy, this kind of darshana, which had a samanvaya of all of these different things around 1500, 1600 BCE, 2000 years before Hegel. Therefore, whether was Krishna himself the originator of all of these incorporated together, or did he reflect a strand of thought that predated even him? We don't know. So the word synthesis is used only in that particular context to address a certain kind of audience, particularly because one is talking about a book that is in the English language. Because, as I said earlier, when I gave a reference to the body, these are all part of the same sentiment, the same darshan.
I think this is an important insight that the vision that we are all part of the same darshan, that we are the part of the larger tree of Sanatan Dharma. This is often missed. This is often either deliberately ignored or often just missed in our modern engagement with our text. I think this happens across the traditions. I mean,
Sorry to interrupt you, Nitin, but
yeah.
the verses you quote also say that over a period of time it had got lost.
Yes, yes, sir. That is true. So, so I think the nature of modern discipline itself is kind of too narrow in the sense it tries to break down everything into small bits and pieces. So it misses the forest for the tree. So that is the problem with modern scholarship. Uh, you mentioned about Krishna as a historical person, the kind of modern researches that has carried in the excavation in Dwarka. I think it was by Dr. S.R. Rao and other Bankim Chandra Chatterjee's answers and all this. What struck me is in the book also you make one statement that um, you say that is Krishna a real person? I don't think anybody asked these questions, but it was asked in 19th century. I think we can say that 19th century or the last 200 years was the beginning of such questions, the questions of historical questions. I mean, before that time, I don't think any of our acharyas in any tradition actually thought in historical terms, whether Rama was historical, whether Krishna was historical, whether any other rishis or deities, they are historical. I mean, we all agreed that they were real, but the question of real was never actually tied to this question of historical. And I see in this a kind of a this conflation of real with historical, the equation of real with historical, as a result of colonial intervention, as a result of Christian intervention, having its basis in the Christian theology, wherein Jesus Christ is posited as a historical person, and his resurrection is a historical event. And I think this obsession with history, or proving the historical personages, has kind of derailed much of modern Hindu youths from engaging with Hindu texts on a philosophical and ethical and spiritual level. What are your thoughts on this, sir?
I think The point you're making is an entirely valid point. But I think there are two parallel questions here, and both are equally important, I think. One is the Bhagavad Gita, or all the Gitas, or all the Shadadarshanas as a philosophical school. That and their importance is completely independent of the historicity. It doesn't really matter what the history was. It's an irrelevant question. No matter how much of analysis we do about history, we will not get anywhere because, in the last resort, any such thing is subjective. So these things stand on their own. This is one issue. The second kind of issue is the tradition, the historical tradition, the history of India, itihasa, itihi asa, and the tendency on the part of many people to dismiss all of this as myth. So it is important for purposes of Indian history to construct that Indian historical tradition, which no longer believes in this myth of a so-called Aryan invasion and the Dravidians being driven back. And there is a generation out there which does not seem to be aware of what the archaeological excavations, the DNA evidence, and all of that have revealed about the Indus Saraswati civilization, and how that needs to be integrated into a perception of whatever is itihasa. So I think that question is also an equally important question. The texts stand on their own regardless of that, but that second question is also an important one. In that, let me stick my neck out and state my point of view. Much of the dating has been based on astronomical calculations. I have a problem with astronomical calculations to start off with, because we are talking about a period of 1000 or 1500 years over which a text obtained its present form. And today I cannot distinguish in any satisfactory way the earlier parts from the later parts. There's been precision of the equinoxes. Our entire system of calculation was based on nakshatras. It is only later that there was a shift to rashis. The geological changes in the Bhagavad Gita itself. I mean, why is Agra high on the first day of the month? It's a valid question to ask, because there were seasonal changes. We had lunar months that had to be integrated with solar months. Sometimes the lunar month began with Amavasya, sometimes it began with Purnima. As a result of all this, and looking at the shlokas, all astronomical interpretations that I've seen, they involve a certain amount of subjectivity in determining what a word means. The astronomical point of view, I think, needs to mesh with other bits of evidence, the so-called triangulation idea. So it has to mesh with the fact that we know the Saraswati dried up around 2700, something like that, 2700 BC. We know of language changes. We know of architectural changes. We know of geological changes. We know of the state of India's urbanization, etc., etc. Hence, I would veer towards the point of view that we are talking about a date of 1400, 1600 BC, something like that, for the Kurukshetra war.
I think the dating issue is a very contentious issue, and with too many evidences pointing too many different directions. Hopefully, in the coming decades, more clarity will come
correct.
on this.
But
Yeah.
we need more research. We can't ignore it and sort of pretend that whatever was said by a textbook we read in the NCERT syllabus is the last word on the subject.
Unfortunately, we cannot go into the direction of NCERT texts and what all no, what all things they say. So, I want to ask a few, one or two questions regarding the final chapters in your book, the second half of the book, starting with the chapter on who am I. I found these chapters to be especially rich. The very crust of your book, the chapter starting with who am I and what I am not, and on the bhakti and all this last 4 5 chapters. uh, I think they really provide a kind of a philosophical perspective, philosophical background to how one should approach Bhagavad Gita, with what questions. I mean, I think I have heard this saying that if you ask the right question, you will get the right answer. If you pose a wrong question, you will get a wrong answer. So I think these chapters really help us to put across right questions to of understanding Bhagavad Gita, before approaching Bhagavad Gita. When I was reading this chapter 6, the Who Am I chapter, you make an important observation towards the end that Bhagavad Gita is not about changing the world, but it is about what we can change in our own selves. I feel this is perhaps one of the most core message of not just the Gita but the Hindu Dharma as a whole, the essence of all forms of yoga and tapasya. So can you elaborate a bit more on it and how Gita brings out this message?
Uh, I should have said something at the beginning that if you look at normal bhashyas of the Gita or normal translations of the Bhagavad Gita, they naturally follow the chapter-wise structure. First chapter, well, not first chapter, second, third, fourth, etc., etc. This book changes that a little bit. It's more theme-wise because the same themes in the Bhagavad Gita across chapters, it goes back and forth because it's in the nature of a conversation between Krishna and Arjuna. So it does not always follow that linear structure. Instead, it has these themes. This book deliberately is not my interpretation of the Bhagavad Gita. It's not meant to be. A, I'm not even very sure I will ever write it, that book. B, even if I were to write that book at some future stage, I'm not ready for it now. The essential argument that is being made here is not even one of asking the right questions, but asking people to ask the questions. After I ask the questions, then I will ask the right questions. So I should ask myself that what am I? Do I interpret myself only in terms of who my father is, who my mother is, my lineage, where I work, what it says on the visiting card, what it says on the passport, what it says on the driving license, who's my boss, who's my subordinate, who's my wife, who's my husband, who's my son, who's my daughter? Is that the definition of who am I? So if you ask the question, who am I? You should arrive at the answer in, as Nitin said, in all of our texts and in the Bhagavad Gita, that I am not this. So that external part has got eliminated. I cannot define myself with respect to external individuals and external objects. They're all external to me. So now I've restricted myself to I. But then what am I? Am I this physical body? To quote Adi Shankaracharya's famous thing, which the book also quotes, Mano buddhi ahankara chittani nahang na cha srotra juve na cha ghrana netre na cha bomana bhumi na teja na vayu chidananda rupaha shivoham shivoham. So I do not define myself in terms of the hands, the arms, the feet, the eyes, the panchendriya, the five senses of perception, the five senses of action. So if I am not the body, there is an essence that remains after the body has gone. But meanwhile, every definition of happiness, unhappiness that we have are invariably either about the external part of it or about what the body goes through. And most definitions of happiness or unhappiness are with respect to these things that the body goes through, which are temporary. So once I've eliminated that, if the body dies, obviously something remains. And what remains is the Atman, what remains is the Jivatman. But that's the final step of realization in the process. When you eliminate the extraneous, when you eliminate the transitory, one of the points made in the book is that the right question to ask is not what do I gain from reading the Bhagavad Gita, but what do I lose from reading the Bhagavad Gita? And what I lose from reading the Bhagavad Gita is the kama, krodha, the lobha, the moha, the mada, the matsarya. And the first step is actually to lose those, develop that non-attachment, because we are all, I believe, on that process of arohan, in that adhyaptic sense. But we are all at different stages in that evolution. So just because X has gone far up the ladder does not mean that Y will also achieve that much. So depending on what we are ready for, because any message, the success of any message does not depend only on the content of the message. It depends on the transmitter. It also depends on the receptivity of the receiver. So the Bhagavad Gita's message, in that sense, I think is very individual specific. I will find in the Bhagavad Gita what I am ready for. And if I'm not ready, I will say, oh, this was a synthesis of 30 different elements, etc., etc.
In the eighth chapter, a very related question to what you just explained. In the eighth chapter, the Jivatma and the Paramatma, you mention about how Gita provides a six-stage process for spiritual emancipation, which you have called as Arohana, the ascendance. So I think this needs it would be very useful for our audience to know a little bit about this. So can you share about this notion of Arohana and the six stages that you mentioned? Shed more light on this and how one should work towards that.
You see, sometimes I'm asked, I'm not asked anymore, but once upon a time he used to be asked, do you believe in God? My counter question always has been, what is God? The word Deva is not God. The word Deva, Devata, Devi, with the same root as shining, resplendent, it simply means the shining one, the resplendent one. One of the things all of our texts say, and the Bhagavad Gita also says, that there is divinity in all of us. There is Deva in all of us. There is Asura in all of us. And the challenge is to enhance the divinity part and curb the asura part. How can I not believe in God? God is there, thus defined in you, me, everyone. Often our reactions to this is yada yada hi dharmasya glanirvavati bharata. Avatara is coming down. Krishna will come down, Vishnu will come down and will save all of us. In some sense, Arohan is exactly the opposite of this. Because it's not that someone will come down as an avatar and save all of us. Instead, it is our process, as I used the example of the ladder, the Arohan, which will elevate us and to help us to discover that divinity, for want of a better word, which is in all of us, which is exactly what Rishi Aravinda also used to say, using slightly different nomenclature. And just as there's been evolution, and this is an old thing, but it's mentioned in the book also, that if you look at the avatars, Vishnu's avatars, they also represent that stage of evolution, that process of evolution. The first bit has been talked about a lot, which is the Matsya becoming the Kurma, becoming the Varaha, becoming the Narasingha, the natural evolution. What I have said, and I hope people don't get upset about it too much, is that Vamana is human but is still short as Vamana, not as Vishnu's avatar. After Vamana, we have Parashurama. Now, Parashuram is strictly speaking not a Brahmana. Parashuram has been born as a Brahmana but behaves as a Kshatriya. Rama and Krishna are not Brahmanas also, and I'm not interpreting the word Brahmana in the cliched sense of a Brahmana priestly class. Brahmana is the ideal person in all of our texts, including the Bhagavad Gita. It is not this Brahmana, Kshatriya, Vaishya, Shudra. It's the ideal person. The first avatar will be a full-fledged Brahmana, according to this definition of the word Brahmana, is Kalki, who will come. So this also represents evolution. Now, in that process of evolution, the first thing we need to do, and I'm not a preacher, but the first thing we need to do is to look inwards, meditate, contemplate, remain quiet, be silent, have that conversation not with others, but have that conversation within you, inside you, and then the process of discovery begins.
Wonderful, sir. This is the, I think, there is no easy way out for spiritual emancipation. The gist is that we all have to put in self-effort, and it is through our own effort that we lift ourselves. That is what is Aravana is all about. So I think we are coming almost towards the end of our discussion, and I have one or two more questions to go. You mentioned in your conversation today, and I think you also mentioned in your book that Ashtavakra Gita is your favorite Gita, and it so happens that it is one of my favorite Gita as well. And I think it is perhaps the most straightforward Gita, most straightforward text among all the texts, and kind of a no-nonsense text which straight away gets into your point. So, can you share more about your engagement with Ashtavakra Gita, and what are your have you translated this text as well? And what do you how should people approach this Ashtavakra Gita? The interested people, yeah.
The Ashtavakra Gita, I have not yet translated because remember I told you that the Gitas, I'm planning 3 volumes. So the Ashtavakra Gita translation will be part of the third. Ashtavakra Gita, of course, there are very good English translations already. Even then I want to do it. If I recall correctly, there's one by Advaita Ashrama in English, which is quite good. Swami Nitya Sarupananda, I think I've forgotten, but there is a very good translation already. As Nitin says, it's no nonsense, it is very direct. And it hovers essentially around two words, mama and aham. Now, if I can get rid of mama and if I can get rid of aham, the two are related. I am along that path of discovery and upliftment. And Ashtavakra is a very skilled teacher. Actually, it's a teacher-student dialogue. He's a very skilled teacher because he says things and then asks Janaka to respond. And then when Janaka responds, there are still imperfections in the answer, and so it goes on. It is much more direct. Obviously, it is about what we would call Vedanta, because it Advaita Vedanta, it is directly that. There is a story about the Ashtavakra Gita, which you of course know, others may not, so let me mention this. When Swami Vivekananda was still Narendranath Datta, Sri Ramakrishna recognized his potential. And when Narendranath Datta used to visit him, Sri Ramakrishna used to ask him to translate the Ashtavakra Gita for him. In the process, not that Sri Ramakrishna needed a translation of the Ashtavakra Gita, but so that in the process, the seeds of Advaita Vedanta would get kindled in Swami Vivekananda.
Wonderful. My final question is again, I want to come back to your translation projects. And you mentioned in your chapter 2, Sanskrit and poetry, you mentioned why it is important to read the text in original and why translations can never fully and truly capture the beauty and the nuance of the original verses. I think a similar argument is made by Rajiv Malhotra in his recent book about Sanskrit non-translatables, how some words cannot be translated. And you also mentioned about Van Buten's translation of Kshatriya as barren, doesn't seeming fit. So my question is, what challenges have you faced as a translator while translating Mahabharata and other texts, and what measures did you take to avoid the well-known pitfalls that accompany any translation project?
I think that's a very good question, and it's a very difficult question also. I think this is from Chapman's translation of Homer and what he says in the introduction, that the job of a translator is to render as accurately as possible what the author intended. And this, I think, is the template. So my purpose is to translate as accurately as is possible what is there in whatever way the Vyasa wrote. In the process, the English may seem not that smooth, may seem a little bit stilted, artificial. I can write better English, but the intention is not to write better English. The intention is to do word for word as best as you can what the original author intended. There are obvious challenges in translating from Sanskrit into a somewhat alien language like English. That's obvious. And some words cannot be translated satisfactorily into English. The dharma, the karma, Adhyatma, even the Atman, the Jivatman, the Paramatman, they can never be translated into English. But I want to make a point that is probably not very obvious to some people. That the nature of the languages is different in a different way. In Sanskrit, and therefore in many Indian languages, the proper name, the noun, the pronoun, they are irrelevant. What is important is the verb.
Yes.
So if I know the verbal root with a reasonable amount of deduction, I can deduce what the meaning of the word is. So if I'm sitting on this chair and I use the word asandaha, the moment you say asandaha, it is conveying to me not only the chair, it is conveying to me an object which gives me the right posture. So when I see a tree and the tree is referred to as padapaha, the image I get is not just of a tree, but of something that is drinking up the water with its feet. Ajagara, I mentioned Ajagara earlier. Ajagara, it's conveying the image to me not just of a boa constrictor, but of something that swallows up a goat, which can be a crocodile also. Now the challenge is, famous shloka again, Nainang chindanti shastrani nainang dahati pavakah na chainang kledayanti apana shosheti maruta. Weapons cannot sever it, slice it. The fire cannot burn it. The water cannot wet it. The wind cannot dry it. Absolutely accurate translation. Whoever does the translation in English will do a little bit of permutation combination. This is essentially a translation. No translation without an annotation and footnotes and an interpretation will explain to you Shastra, because Shastras were made out of metals. They came from the earth. Pavaka is the fire. And I've got the water and I've got the wind. I've got the four of the five Panchabhutas, the four elements. And space is everywhere. Pavaka is not just fire, it is not Agni. Pavaka. What is Pavaka? Pavaka is something that purifies. Now, this is the biggest challenge. And it is a big challenge to communicate this to people to whom the word I comes with a capital letter. In Sanskrit and Indian languages, I is never with a capital letter. The implication of this is normally you won't say, I am Nitin. You will normally say, all Indians, you will normally say, I am called Nitin. I am known as Nitin. So it is never in the forefront. So the moment it is in any Indian language, I think the putting aham at the back comes naturally to us.
That is wonderful, Dr. Devroy. I in Kannada or in Sanskrit, Mama Nama Nitin. We don't say I am Nitin. Yeah. And I never thought about this in this way at all. Now, the moment you said, it really struck me that our languages, Indian languages, how the language is so much rooted in our worldview and our philosophy, and this is a very good example for this. With this, we come to a conclusion of this exceptionally fascinating session, and I hope we could do more sessions in future. And thank you, Dr. Vivek Debroy, for agreeing this. And I personally extremely enjoyed the session, and I am sure those who read your book will be very much find it very much useful, very much enlightening, and I hope they would take up more serious study of Bhagavad Gita. And after all, that is the purpose you have written, to inspire the youngsters among us to take up more serious study of our text rather than just hearsays and reading half a verses from here and there. Thank you again for doing this, sir.
Thank you, Nitin.